Welcome to our sixth event of the CLAS Spring Lecture Series titled Hope and Resilience, Lessons from the Climate Parliament for Latin America, Africa, and South Asia with Professor Sergio Missana. Muchas gracias, Sergio, por acompañarnos. For those joining us on the live stream, kindly submit any questions or comments via the YouTube chat section. Before I introduce the MA student who is going to introduce our guests, just wanted to make sure everyone is okay, temperature-wise, too hot, too cold. Should we lower the lights a bit? We want to stay, so we get a little less, gracias, Jimena.
I don't know if I'm doing
That's
it.
You want both of them?
I'm gonna finagle with them in a moment. How about that? I'll go and finagle with them.
You
Yeah.
ask me to do it because then when I break it.
Break it, you buy it.
So at the Center for Latin American Studies, we have the tradition of inviting one of our MA students to introduce our speaker. And so I give the podium over to Greg.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is my honor to introduce the speaker for today, Dr. Sergio Missana, Secretary General of the Climate Parliament, as well as a renowned novelist, journalist, scholar, and leading environmental advocate. Dr. Missana holds a PhD in Spanish from Stanford University, where he also teaches literature as part of the Stanford Chile program. His career has spanned multiple continents and disciplines. He previously served as the Director of Publications and Head of International Relations at the BBVA Foundation in Madrid and was a member of the Governing Council of the European Foundation Center in Brussels. In a critical chapter of Chile's history, Dr. Missana was editor of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, documenting human rights violations committed during Chile's military dictatorship from 1973 to 1999. Beyond his impactful work in climate advocacy and human rights, Dr. Missana is the author of 16 books in Spanish, including novels, essays, travel, and children's books. His novel, The Transentients, translated by Jessica Powell, was published in 2021. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Missana.
Yes, gracias. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's happened to me once or twice to be in a social environment, in a social event, a lunch, and somebody at some point turns to me and says, Sergio, you work on climate change. Is it really that bad? Come on. And I try to be as honest as possible. And usually what happens is within a few minutes, an awkward silence descends. And then swiftly somebody turns to sports or something. Everybody is relieved. So I am aware that I have you as captive audience, but I will, in my talk, try to talk about some reasons for hope, as well as alluding to the severity of the crisis. So I will say a few words about the organization that I'm Secretary General of, the Climate Parliament. A little bit of, I'll say a few words also about the message that we try to communicate to the politicians in our network. A little bit about Latin America, about our projects as well, without going into too much detail. And then I'd like to finish with a message about some reasons for hope. Hope and resilience is also the title of the talk. I'm going to, this works. All right, so the Climate Parliament is an international multi-partisan network of members of Congress and Parliament working to combat climate change and protect the living planet. We are basically a network of environmental and climate champions. So we work with elected politicians, and we do a very careful job at selecting politicians that are leaders in their parliaments, that are influential, that are motivated. Sometimes they are not climate champions or environmental champions to begin with, but we do a process of engagement whereby they become such, and sometimes with really extraordinary results. So we are, we identify and we select and we nurture the relationship with the parliamentarians ourselves. That's very important because in certain international fora where parliamentarians participate, they are designated by their own parliaments, and you get a very, very different constituency if you do that. You get a very, very different engagement. Our method of work is collaborative, dialogical, and it's based on building relationships of trust with a very, very strong focus on action. So we organize a lot of meetings, international meetings, regional events, national events, but always the focus is to move toward action, not just have a nice conversation. We have worked a lot in recent years on climate. Our name is Climate Parliament, but we are actually engaged on all three dimensions of a larger environmental crisis that includes, on one hand, climate change, a climate crisis, but on another hand, the biodiversity crisis, and also a third one, pollution and waste. So we are expanding our work to work beyond climate, but climate is our main focus. Why do we work with parliamentarians? This is, by the way, picture of an event that we did a few months ago in Malawi on sustainable cooking, and I will say a few words about sustainable cooking in a minute. So, why we work with legislators? First of all, because they are the unique group of people that have a mandate to make crucial and critical decisions. So we engage a lot with officials, regulators, people in government, but really the direction of travel is determined by the elected politicians rather than the more technical people. They are a key source of political will, which is the key ingredient for tackling the crisis. And of course, they play a crucial function in terms of shaping legislation, regulation, budgets, oversight of government, as well as the convening power to bring other important and influential stakeholders together. Just as an example of the importance of parliamentarians, in the year 1999, a small group of German parliamentarians in the Bundestag, actually one of them, Hans-Josef Fell, we still have a collaboration or a relationship with, decided to try to pass what is called a feed-in tariff in Germany. This is a slightly obsolete mechanism for integrating renewable energies into the grid, but it was very advanced at the time, which means fixing a price, a guaranteed price for the producer of renewable energy, in this case solar, and then giving them priority access to feeding the grid. They faced resistance from the power sector, from the government, but they insisted, they pushed it through. And in 2000, the year 2000, a feed-in tariff law was approved in Germany. Within 3 years, Germany, which is not exactly a sunny country, had 50% of solar panels in the world. This was imitated first by Italy, then by Spain. And this was quite a crucial development in making, giving the world a chance now for a better future, as it helped bring down the prices of solar panels, particularly produced in China. In terms of our work, the Climate Parliament, this is an image of an international network, an international meeting that we organized in Istanbul, bringing together about 80 parliamentarians last November. The core of our work is raising awareness among the parliamentarians, capacity building, informing them about the severity, the seriousness, the dangers, the urgency of tackling the environmental and climate crisis. And also through this process, we build motivation to take action. Second, oftentimes, as a result of this awareness raising, the legislators organize themselves in climate parliament groups in their own countries. And these groups can be informal, and they usually start being informal, but sometimes in some countries where there is no official climate change committee in parliament, they become officialized. It's happened in Uganda, it's happened in Sierra Leone and other places, but we don't place a lot of importance to this process of formalization. We're fine with informal as long as it's nimble, it's geared toward action. There are two things that we gently demand when the parliamentarians decide to organize themselves in a climate parliament group. One is that is representation from across the political spectrum. For instance, we work in the European Parliament, and it would be very easy to have a group of the Green Party, exclusively from the Green Party, a lot harder to motivate MPs, as we call them, members of parliament from other groups. Specifically, actually, our chair, our president, is a member of the European Parliament from Finland. She is with the former Minister of Environment of Finland, and she is from the conservative group in the European Parliament. So working with parliamentarians from government and opposition, but in this country would be bipartisan and others multi-partisan, is very important for us. And also gender diversity. We have had also parliamentarians that come with a group of men and say this is our group, and we strongly encourage that is not okay. We have done a lot of work in Africa in recent years, where 25% of MPs are women, and our group has been 40% engaging with women. In this meeting, in this summit in Istanbul, it was actually 50%. So that's very important for a number of reasons, including, and we also collaborate with organizations that work at this interface between renewable energy and gender. We feed ideas to the parliamentarians for action. So it's not only about convening them and educating them and mobilizing them, but also giving them ideas. Of course, they are free to decide what they want to pursue. It's their sovereign decision. The good thing about that is that we have never been accused of interventions, because they are paid by their taxpayers and elected to do whatever they decide to do, which is giving them ideas. And then when they decide to take action, we support them with staff whenever possible. Sometimes it's very effective to have staff in a country. Right now, we have staff in about 20 countries, but even if we don't, we can still provide support. So just as an example of the message that we communicate to the MPs, and this in a way is a meta part of my presentation, because I know you're all very well informed. So I'm not going to explain the urgency of climate change, but I just explain a little bit the kind of message that we try to communicate to the MPs. You probably know that the whole climate negotiation has focused around trying to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial time. So before the Industrial Revolution started, the engines that required burning coal and therefore emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the temperature of the Earth was fairly stable. And the idea of all these negotiations is to try to stay within 1.5 degrees above that level. So the main point of urgency is that in 2024, we hit 1.55 degrees. It was the hottest year on record, and one very prestigious, well-known climate scientist, Johan Rockström, has said 2024 will be remembered as a mild year. You know, we have to brace ourselves for a very, very rough ride. Another very, very well-known climate scientist, Jim Hansen, you probably know him. He has said that 2 degrees are out of the question. We're on a trajectory that goes way beyond that. So this is a map of temperature, basically starting at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and the final part, this part here, shows basically an exponential increase of temperature. Scientists say we haven't hit 1.5 degrees because they calculate on average over a period of a decade or so. But so they are aware that we have hit 1.5, but officially they keep saying, oh no, we're at 1.3. But the truth is that we are beyond that. Actually, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, says that we are on a trajectory, if things don't radically change, to 4 degrees. And 4 degrees is a very different planet. Since the last glaciation, we explained to the parliamentarians, this is all meta, right? During the 10,000 years where civilizations flourished, there were oscillations of 0.5 more or less degrees, 0.5 degrees. The Earth never hit 2 degrees in the last 3 million years. And there are very troubling signs that we are impacting the buffering capacity of the Earth itself to absorb this kind of heat. The oceans and entire nature absorb more than half of fossil fuel emissions and about 90% of excess heat. Jim Hansen, that very famous scientist who used to be at NASA, has said that every day the oceans absorb the equivalent of 800,000 Hiroshima bombs worth of heat as part of his studies on the heat imbalance of the world. And also there are tipping points. So points in the Earth where there's going to be changes that they are irreversible. And one of the first to go is going to be the coral reefs, but it's happening in the Amazon and in other places in the oceans in Antarctica. Yeah, it's it. So the greatest hazard there's several impacts of climate change, but the greatest hazard is just the increase of temperature. This map shows number of days where there was heat during the last year that was dangerous for human life, and it was more than a month worth of dangerous days in many parts of the world. Basically, all over the world, there have been heat waves, and these heat waves are pushing the limits of what humans can survive. And we are really coming close to the threshold of mass casualty events. In 2003, there was a heat wave in northern France, and 70,000 people died as a consequence of that heat wave in northern France. Deaths because of heat, sorry, this is a sort of a doom and gloom. I will turn this, but deaths because of heat are hard to calculate because people don't only die of heat stroke, but it basically causes internal organ damage. So it can be estimated statistically, right? Once you have a heat wave, then you can estimate it in relationship with a normal year. But there are certainly certain conditions where humans without air conditioning cannot survive. Either sustain very hot temperatures or combined with humidity, what's called the wet bulb effect, where over 35 degrees Celsius with 100% humidity, it's hard for humans without air conditioning to survive more than a few days because your skin cannot regulate its temperature through sweat. I wanted to show a slightly disturbing image, so I'll do it very quickly. This was a heat wave in Australia in 2019, and those are forest bats, fruit-eating bats, that above a certain level, 42 degrees Celsius, just fell down to the ground and dead in mass numbers. And we very, very much hope that that won't be humans anytime soon. So this was a graph prepared by the New York Times, but it was based on a study that was published by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, one of many, many studies on the human climate niche, which is what is the band of temperature where humans can survive. And basically what this map shows is the areas of the world today, located particularly in Africa, where the average temperature, summer and winter, all day long, all year long, day or night, is above 29 degrees Celsius or 84 Fahrenheit. And in those areas, nobody lives. It's too hot for not only for humans to live, but also for agriculture or for animals to survive. And basically, this map shows that in 2070, this is the map of the world, of areas where no human can survive, but also, again, no livestock and no plants or agriculture. In Latin America, obviously the Amazon and in Central America and the Caribbean, the situation is very dire, but also in Africa and also in South Asia and Southeast Asia, Australia. And at this point, this is more or less the best case scenario. This is not 4 degrees, this is 3.3 degrees. We'll talk about the the Paris Agreement in a moment, but if everything goes according to plan, if we're very optimistic about climate negotiations, this is the scenario that we're looking at. And this means basically the evacuation of the tropics. We're talking about collapse of agriculture, most likely war for the scarce resources that will be available, migration at a level that we've never seen before, economic collapse. And obviously this doesn't mean that the areas that are not in red are going to be easy to live in. We're looking at a very tough scenario. This is a map prepared by the New Scientist, not as scientifically precise as this. This is more like an artist's impression, but this is the world at 4 degrees. This is the world where we're supposed to be going. And the areas in yellow and brown are areas that are uninhabitable because of heat. And we see West Antarctica ice sheet is gone, and all the areas in red are inundated. So a lot of coastal towns and areas are gone. We had an event in the Seychelles Islands recently where we were talking about sustainable tourism and green and renewable energy in small island developing states. And we had an expert from the World Meteorological Organization, and Claire Ransom, and she was saying that this is the trajectory where we're going now, but also she used a word that stuck in my mind. She said, "We're one to work toward having a world that is recognizable to us," right? And this world is not that. This is a little bit old. It's from 2023, but basically, we should be cutting emissions according to climate negotiations that are made of about 7% per year. And we are actually increasing emissions year after year. So 2024 saw the record of emissions, of fossil fuel emissions in history. which points to the fact that the climate crisis is really a crisis of global governance. The climate issue is one of those issues that it's in a way not solvable through the nation state framework. Timothy Morton, a philosopher, has spoken of hyper objects, objects that are too large for our minds to comprehend, and climate seems to be one of them. So we are the greenhouse gas emissions are at a record level, and they are increasing. So I was saying global governance. I don't know how familiar you are with this, but this process of negotiation that has been going for 3 decades now. This is an image of the Paris Agreement. The 2 women on the left are the real architects of the Paris Agreement, Laurence Toubiana and Christiana Figueres, and then the Secretary General of the UN in the middle, and the Prime Minister of France at the time, right. Laurence is a partner of the Climate Parliament. We have done quite a lot of work with her and the organization that she runs, the European Climate Foundation. Really an architect of this, which was a very important moment in the negotiations, where basically the climate negotiations failed for many years, leading to one climactic moment at, these are called COPs, Presidents of the COP, that stands for Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. There's a COP for climate, there's a COP for biodiversity, there's a COP for biodiversification, and there's a COP for wetlands, etc., etc. So all of these conventions under the UN umbrella have their own meetings, but the COP usually is referred to the climate one. And the important COPs happen every 5 years, more or less. The COP, the biggest disaster of a COP was in 2009 in Copenhagen, where really all the negotiations collapsed. And then somebody came up with the genius idea of, rather than negotiating cuts in emissions, having voluntary cuts or voluntary contributions, which are called NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, which is a genius creative invention from the point of view of diplomacy, but unfortunately rather useless to tackle the climate crisis. So the great thing about, the NDCs, again, a stroke of diplomatic genius, but some people speak of problem realism versus process realism. From the point of view of process, this is genius. From the point of view of being equal to the task of the problem, not so much. But the one great thing about the Paris Agreement was that instead of setting the target at 2 degrees, it set it at 1.5. Unfortunately, that is a little bit gone. Greta Thunberg, who is a great leader in climate, basically considers the COPs and the whole process as greenwashing. I personally think that it's a great framework for when the governments decide to take climate seriously, which is not happening right now. You're probably familiar with the idea of the tragedy of the commons, which is the title of a very famous article in the late 60s by Hardin, basically describing this game theory dynamic whereby a number of rational actors take rational decisions in their own benefit, resulting in everyone else being worse off, everyone, including themselves. And this is compounded by what has been called more recently the tragedy of the horizon, which is simply the fact that climate change unfolds over a period of time that is longer than the decision-making of economic actors. Let's say a CEO has to respond to his shareholders, and he can say, I'm taking decisions that will hurt our company, but will be good for the planet. And of course, politicians need to be re-elected over short periods of time. the Indian novelist Amitav Ghosh has called this the great derangement. Of course, the negotiations, there's been an element of climate justice, and that is something that we might discuss later, but simply to think that between China, the US, and India, the three largest emitters, they emit more than 50% of greenhouse gases, and the bottom 100 countries emit 3%. So that has been part of the negotiation and in a way part of the dynamic that led to the NDCs ultimately, in which each country determines what they want to do. If the NDCs were implemented, we're looking at the previous map. We're looking at 3.2 degrees more or less. But also some of those NDCs are not even implemented very, how would you say, more. There's no oversight exactly about how much of that is being really done. So a few words about Latin America. Latin America in total, including and the Caribbean, is responsible for 9% of greenhouse gas emissions, but obviously very vulnerable to the effects of the climate crisis. This is the picture of the Amazon. And the Amazon is crucial for a number of reasons. There was a recent drought in the Amazon, which was the worst ever, lasted for many years. And it is estimated that when the trees that die rot, the emissions, the methane emissions from that rotting will be more than the emissions of the US throughout an entire year. The Amazon has actually already tipped from being a carbon sink to a carbon source. So the Amazons emit carbon right now, but the danger, the real danger, is that it's very, very close to a point of no return where it will tip from rainforest to savanna. And that could happen at 1.52 degrees. So that could happen in the next few decades. Of course, there are other impacts in Latin America, the impact on water, loss of glaciers, the loss of the Campos de Hielo in Chilean Patagonia, which are the last remnants of the large glaciers that cover South America during the last glaciation. The oceans are, of course, in danger from acidification, from increasing temperature, sea level rise, but also the ice shelves in Western Antarctica, and if they collapse, we would see a rise of meters of sea level. Extreme weather events, of course, superstorm, wildfires like we have in California, heat waves, as I was mentioning, and also migration. There is already, even within the United States, there's a lot of migration now that is attributable to climate. But as a colleague of mine, Nick Dunlop, likes to say, there are feedback loops, physical feedback loops. So consequences of climate change that produce more heating. Like, for instance, when you lose ice cover in the Arctic, you replace ice that is white and reflects sun and energy back to space. You replace it with dark water that absorbs more heat. So that's an example of a feedback loop. But Nick, my colleague, speaks of a political feedback loop that has to do with immigration, with migration. So climate generates migration, and migration leads to electing governments that are bonding around migration. That the super conservative movements around the world are bonding around that common issue without the difference. But migration is what binds them together, and in a way that leads to the election of politicians that deny climate change and that take policies that increase climate change, and you have a neat political loop. I mean, you have a loop there that is very, very dangerous. And as I was showing with that map prepared by the New York Times, migration is going to increase exponentially. So a little bit of the good news. This is a bit old, but it was prepared by the Inter-American Development Bank that does a lot of work in Latin America on renewable energy, and they do a lot of work on studies both of renewable energy resource potential, but also of interconnections, which is a very important theme. So this is a bit older than recent studies, but it's a neat map. And basically what they did is they asked the question, what percentage of electricity consumption can you satisfy with renewable energy in Latin America and the Caribbean, excluding large hydro, which is problematic from an environmental point of view. So basically solar and wind, what percentage of energy demand can you satisfy? And their answer was 100%, 66 times, right? They put 22 because they estimate that in 2050, demand will have tripled. You know, the energy transition means electrifying everything first, and then satisfying that energy consumption, electric vehicles, particularly industry, with clean energy. So basically, and I would say if there's one thing specific to Latin America when it comes to the energy transition, is precisely what is not in this study, which is abundance of hydro resources in countries like Brazil, like Colombia, like Chile, like Costa Rica. So Latin America could power the whole world if you had proper interconnection. So that's part of a more positive story. This is an image of a solar array in the Atacama Desert by a very well-known American photographer, James Stillings, who has been documenting renewable energy around the world for many years. This is part of a project that he did in the Atacama, where he took photographs of the relationship between renewable energy and mining, the mining industry. And he asked me to write an essay as a contribution to this book, which was published in a very prestigious German photography publishing house called Stiel. But yes, I wanted to just mention that the leaders in renewable energy in Latin America, I would say that the leader is Uruguay, perhaps followed by Costa Rica, which relies very much on hydro, and Chile, which has a lot of solar in the Atacama, even though Chile has been facing some struggles recently, basically feeding all of the energy that generates into its grid. But certainly, things are very good for Latin America for renewable energy, and specifically in northern Chile because of wind, and in Patagonia, of sun, and in Patagonia because of the wind resource, which is the best onshore wind resource in the world. We have collaborated with a professor from the University of Liège, and he has done calculations that you could power the entire economy of Brazil only with Patagonian wind at actually a very cheap price. Also, Latin America will be at the center of the negotiations. As I was saying, the important COPs happen roughly every 5 years, where the NDCs are negotiated, and so the COPs leading to that are preparatory, and then the COPs after that are kind of trying to implement what was agreed. So the last important one was in Glasgow, and it was supposed to be 2020, but it was delayed because of the pandemic. And this is the next big one, and it's going to happen in Belém, in northern Brazil, in the Amazon this year. And actually, we have been engaging with Brazilian parliamentarians and others, and we're going to organize a summit in Rio, not in Belém, for logistical reasons. Regarding the work of the Climate Parliament in Latin America, as I was saying, we have concentrated in Africa and South Asia in recent years, but we have done work in Latin America. This is a picture of a group of Latin American MPs in a solar array near Santiago in my country, in Chile, some years ago. We have done work on the Costa Rican system for payment for ecosystem services. We have done work in Chile on a transmission law that was important for generation. In Mexico on a project called the Green Roots Initiative, and we're currently working on a project creating diplomatic links at the parliamentary level between Brazil and India. that I would be happy to say a few words later. Now I'd like to just very briefly, I know that there's a limited capacity for listening to somebody talk, but say a few words about projects of the Climate Parliament, specific projects. And one of them is called the Green Grids Initiative, which is an example of what I would call parliamentary diplomacy and the convening power of MPs. And this is basically based on the fact that renewable energy is increasing, but it's not replacing fossil fuels. NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab in the US, did a study some years ago asking a similar question to that study by BID, which was the Inter-American Development Bank, which was what percentage of the US energy demand could you satisfy with rooftop solar? If you put panels on every properly oriented roof in every building and house in the US, what percentage? Their conclusion was 40%, which is a lot, but we need to at least double production of renewable energy in order to leave fossil fuels behind, if not more. So you need basically to have large-scale solar and wind, and this large-scale solar and wind needs to be in isolated places that are not going to displace agriculture, because as the planet increases, food security is going to be in danger more and more, and you cannot displace forests because forests are essential for carbon absorption, for biodiversity, and for many other reasons. So it has to be in deserts, it has to be offshore, and for that you need grids. So grids, transmission grids, that are key infrastructure for the energy transition, and that's why we focused on grids for a long time. What I was saying about Latin America 66 times is the same everywhere else in the world. And it's been calculated that the energy of the sun that hits the earth in 1 hour could power the entire world economy for 1 year. And engineers have calculated that a solar array of 250 miles by 250 miles could power the entire world. Obviously, you don't do it in one place. You do solar arrays scattered all over the place. But for that, you need the grids, and particularly a grid technology called high voltage direct current transmission, which has very few losses. It can transmit over large distances with minimal loss, and it can go underwater. So these connections already exist, particularly in Europe and in China. So what we did was we created a network of ministers of environment of about 30 countries. And this event, in the end, we ended up negotiating with the UK government for the COP in Glasgow, which was the last important COP. And we basically, they took it over. And we're a relatively small NGO. They took it over with the power of the UK government, but we launched it with the prime ministers of India in the picture here, with some of our Indian MPs, the prime minister of the UK and of Samoa, and Jennifer Granholm, Secretary of Energy in the US at the time, ministers from Australia, France, Nigeria, and other places in Glasgow. So this is still going on. One of the projects that we're working on is an interconnection project in southern Africa called Zizabona, that connects Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, and Namibia. So again, one example of projects where we feed the ideas to the MPs, and in this case, the MPs organize themselves through diplomacy and ultimately help us mobilize governments. Like in this case, the MP on the right is the head of our group, Dr. Sanjay Jaswal is the head of our group in India. And he has been key in engaging with the Indian government. But we also have a strong group of opposition MPs in India. Currently, we're developing a project called Parliamentarians for Climate Finance. And this is a project, a very ambitious project that we're implementing in 15 African countries, sub-Saharan African countries, actually, in collaboration with a UN agency called UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, and funded by the Green Climate Fund. which is the main vehicle for channeling the resources from the global north to the global south in the context of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So again, this is a project for mobilizing the convening power of MPs to increase the flow of climate finance into the participating countries. And we are in conversations to expand this work in Latin America, among others in Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and Costa Rica. So yeah, I would say in terms of trends, this is the COP that just happened in Azerbaijan. I would say in terms of trends in the European, in the international conversation, and this goes beyond Latin America. One thing is that a lot of the climate community is focusing more and more on adaptation. And you're probably familiar with the distinction between mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is actions that try to cut fossil fuels, that cut emissions, basically, so address the problem. Whereas adaptation has to do with building resilience in the communities, in the infrastructure, and dealing with the consequences in a fair and efficient manner. So adaptation is a key focus now. I would say regarding that if you look at the maps that I showed before, adaptation is very important. I would say one key adaptation, and it's something that we're working on, is particularly in villages, having shared air-conditioned spaces where people can take refuge during the killer heat waves. So, that's going to be a key adaptation thing, because otherwise we're going to have human beings falling like that's where in the Australian forest. But another shift has been a stronger and stronger focus on climate finance as a key theme. So you can show me the money moment. In the COP in Copenhagen, so many years ago, it was agreed that countries from the global north would contribute $100 billion a year to mitigation and adaptation projects in the global south. And the Green Climate Fund that we're collaborating on was created a year later to be one of the main channels for these funds. But currently, it is becoming clear that without going into the numbers, because also the numbers differ according to who presents them, but basically, if we're going to stay within a safe threshold, the needed funds are in the trillions. The committed funds are in the billions, and the funds actually spent are in the billions. So we're really, there's an enormous gap in climate finance. At the COP in Baku, which was the last one, the main thing resulting from there was an agreement of increasing that 100 billion fund to 300 billion fund, much to the consternation of the southern, to the developing world in Baku. I mean, 300 billion is a joke, basically, and also it's very sloppily done in terms of where do the funds come from, how this is organized. It's really not enough. I would say one trend in the global north has been, rather than I would say development assistance, more and more thinking of the fact that this gap has to be filled by private investment. And so we collaborate with the World Bank, for instance, and they're saying that the bank is turning more and more from a grant-giving bank to a leveraging bank. So really mobilizing the private sector is becoming, then I'm speaking of a trend worldwide. Another thing to take into consideration when we talk of finances is that I was saying the needed amount is in the trillions. It's about 3 trillion a year. The subsidies for fossil fuels in the world are about 7. So we need this, and we're going backwards. We need 3 steps ahead, and we're going 7 steps backwards every year. And that calculation, by the way, of the 7 trillion is by the IMF, not by some, radical left NGO. It's the International Monetary Fund calculates 7 trillion so far. The way they calculate it is direct subsidies, but also what they call the externalities of the impact on human health and on the environment. So as part of this project, Parliamentarians for Climate Finance, we're focusing quite strongly on green zones and green energy zones, which are specifically designated areas that are very good for renewable energy and renewable industry, and where we're going to be working very closely with the community, among other things, to find mechanisms for lowering the risk of investment. Building a renewable energy plant in Texas cost is much, much cheaper than building it in Ghana. And when it comes to renewable energy, the majority of your cost is your initial investment. So in a way, the cost of money is the crucial thing for developing renewables. And the cost of money in the developing world is very expensive because of the perception of risk. So we are working on risk mechanisms, particularly guarantees, and this is something that the Swedish government is working on, the World Bank and others, but also going with zones within countries, especially designated zones, is a way of avoiding the opposition of vested interest and corruption. So if we say, if you try to change legislation across a whole country, or easy permitting, for instance, which is crucial, if you do it in a specially designated zone, we hope it's easier than trying to do it across a whole country where you could be going head to head against very powerful vested interests. We are going to be collaborating very strongly with the local communities, including giving them ownership, and in some cases working on rooftop solar at the household level. By the way, our idea of green zones, made it into a pledge done by a number of governments at the Azerbaijan COP, actually 57 governments, pledged to work on what is called green and green zones and corridors. And we also did a parliamentary declaration on that. So that's one of our strategies right now, to work at this zonal level, particularly now that the sort of at the government level, things are going in the wrong direction, and certainly stalled when it comes to climate negotiation. We work with a lot of partners, and this is just one partnership. We're part of a group called Climate Compatible Growth, and this is basically a research group on different aspects of our logos in the middle, just because of the shape of our logo, not because of our importance. But this group includes Oxford, Cambridge, College London, Imperial College. KTH is the Swedish Royal University of Technology. But we collaborate, as I was saying, with the World Meteorological Organization, with MIGA, which is the guarantee bit of the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, Rocky Mountain Institute, in different informal or more formal capacities. We have, for instance, a formal collaboration with something called the International Solar Alliance, also with the Pan-African Parliament. Our key partner is UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, with whom we have implemented projects in Africa, and we're now doing that project on climate finance. I had mentioned the European Climate Foundation, also another venue called the Climate Emergency Collaboration Group, et cetera, et cetera. So we not only collaborate with the parliamentarians, but with a lot of other institutions. Our expertise is mobilizing political will and engaging with the parliamentarians, so we rely on experts on climate, on experts on certain engineering aspects of the transition. We have experts in-house, but we also very much rely on external expertise for, and particularly finding the right experts to communicate to the MPs and translating the knowledge to the MPs. Just very quickly, to reaching the end, just a few, I'll enumerate very quickly some of the projects that we're working on. One of them is called Modern Energy Cooking Services, or MEX, which is a research product coordinated by this university, Loughborough, that basically tackles clean cooking, and particularly they work on this very efficient solar pressure cookers. And I don't know if you're aware, but cooking is a huge issue that is social and health and environmental. 4 million people die every year because of indoor pollution from cooking, mostly women and children, from cooking with biomass, with firewood and charcoal. There's a huge deforestation problem from people that go out into the woods and collect firewood for cooking. It's been the time that women lose going out and gathering the wood has been estimated in terms of percentage of GDP by some organizations. And also cooking is a way of increasing demand, which helps lower the price for what are called mini grids, which are small grids that are not connected to the system. One key problem with mini grids for rural communities is that because of low demand, the price is much more expensive than utility connected. So the more productive uses you have, including cooking, it helps to bring the price down. In India, we're working on a project on solarization of agriculture, solar water pumps, and energy efficiency in small enterprises. I mentioned the diplomatic collaboration between India and Brazil. We're beginning to work on sustainable cooling in South Asia, including buildings and agricultural cold chain. We're beginning also to work on what's called grid-enabled distributed energy in Nigeria, which are mini grids that are connected to the grid. And this is, mini grids, usually people think of very rural communities that don't have connection to the grid. But more and more, they're becoming relevant in areas that are connected to the grid, even in places like the US, because during heat waves, you have the problem of the danger of the heat of the grid overheating or the cables sagging, and there's a moment where you have to disconnect the grid to prevent wildfires. So if you have mini grids, that will give you resilience, even in a place like in a wealthy country like the US. But certainly we're working on that in Nigeria. So mini grids that are autonomous, that can generate their own energy, but at some points they can export their surplus to the grid. And so it's an adaptation mitigation kind of effort. We have done quite a lot of work on sustainable transport, also on clean tourism, and also on regional grids, particularly in Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, a different project similar to the green grids. So I don't know how I'm doing time, but
maybe 2 minutes.
All right. Okay. So the hope part will be quick. Really very quickly, just a few reasons for hope. One, that there is a carbon budget, meaning if we stop emitting now, the Earth would regulate its temperature, particularly through the action of the oceans. Second is renewable energy and green industry. The fact that renewable energy, as I mentioned, is abundant. We have the technology to replace fossil fuels entirely, and it's much cheaper. Another reason is that things eventually will get so bad that governments will react. It sounds. And another one for me is history. You might be familiar with him, but I wanted to mention, the fact, I wanted to tell a story about one of our former MPs in Chile a few years ago. He came to a TV show and he noticed that everybody else on this debate that he was going to have was a man like him, and he walked out. And people say, oh, he's overreacting. He was a member of the climate parliament at the time. And he's now the president of Chile, by the way, Gabriel Boric, but that's besides the point. He refused to participate in a panel only with men. And what I was thinking is not that he was particularly enlightened. I was thinking perhaps Boric, the same Boric 20 years earlier, wouldn't have noticed that there were no women in that panel, right? So my point is that what is common sense, what is so obvious that it's invisible to us, can shift, and that's what we're working for. I've been thinking, for instance, that the World Health Organization considered homosexuality as a mental disease until 1992, right? So things shift so quickly that now we think these people were insane, and it's 1992. You would say 1892, all right, but it's very recent. And in the case of Jefferson, I was just thinking of the beginning, the famous beginning of the Declaration of Independence, where it talks about human rights, right? But it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And what I think is nothing self-evident about human rights at that time, right? But in a short period of time, the human rights were an innovation at the time, were completely new, but for them already they were self-evident, right? So, and also, I always think that you could think of this as a moral evolution, where we are superior to our ancestors, right? We can be even derisive, but we can think that our grandchildren will probably despise us for reasons that we ignore, right? We have no idea. They're going to think, oh man, they used to have passports, how disgusting, how discriminatory. For us, it's completely, oh, I need to renew my passport. It's a practical thing, right? So we are in a way superior morally to people that came in the past, but that doesn't guarantee that others will be superior to us. So this is almost like a cheesy Hallmark thing, but it's Gandhi. It says first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. But it has to do with this mysterious process that it's not completely well described by social psychology, where ideas that come from from a minority, struggle and struggle and struggle, and suddenly there's a tipping point and they become accepted. I always like that idea of Raymond Williams, that in all societies you have emergent, dominant, and residual elements interplaying at the same time. And the emergent is often invisible, right? And then suddenly something happens and you have a dip very quickly. This is so this is to illustrate that change can happen very quickly. This is two pictures taken in Fifth Avenue in New York. The one on the left is 1900. The one on the right is 1913. And what you see here is a sea of horse-drawn carriages. And sorry for the quality of the image, one internal combustion car. Mm-hmm. And then in 1913, you see a sea of internal combustion cars and one horse-drawn carriage. And also that leads to try to avoid the sentimental vision about innovation. In other words, innovators then can become reactionaries, right? In this case, the performance of that technology. So change can happen very, very fast. And my last slide and my last reason for hope, also a little bit sentimental, but it's youth, right? Also, social psychology studies have shown that contrary to popular belief, people's political convictions don't change that much with age. People tend to think that young people are radicals and then they become conservatives as we all age. But evidence doesn't prove that. Of course, leadership is crucial. I think Greta Thunberg is probably the closest thing we have to a global leader on these issues. But at the same time, I always think that we're used to a Hollywood narrative, just 30 seconds in, a Hollywood narrative where that almost like a messiah structure, right? A young person has completely normal, even banal, suddenly is supposed to save the world. They have a mission, they didn't know, they have to come to, and then there's a fight against the forces of evil, and then they save the universe or the world or whatever. But I think a lot about collective activism. So what we do, first of all, the Climate Parliament can't take credit for everything it does because we are collaborating. There's some things we feed ideas to the MPs, but what the MPs do with those ideas, and many other people are playing a part. But we are in the business of that big tipping point of changing minds, of a battle for common sense in a way. And so I think there's a dynamic between leadership that is so important. But I wanted to show Greta with her colleagues because it's a collective endeavor. It's not just about one person or one organization like the Climate Parliament. So I'd love to happy to take questions.
So we have, I believe, 15 minutes for a question. Is my math correct? Let me, before I hand it over to MA students, just make a quick comment and say thank you, Sergio, for situating Latin America in a broader context. That was very much part of a goal of today's event. It's something we discussed in preparation. This is the Center for Latin American Studies, but you know what? Latin America does not exist in isolation. And it's interesting to think of Latin America within the global South and in, these eye-opening dynamics with the global North, where, for instance, the region that we study produces only 9% of the emissions and yet gets the short end of the stick in so many ways. Also, we have interdisciplinarity in action. Did you notice that Professor Missana is a fiction writer who also happens to be I'm going to use the L word, lobbyist, but it's not a bad word in this context at least, right? And he also gets reports by scientists and by political science people, how does that even work? That's interdisciplinarity really out there in the world. So we're very appreciative. The floor is open. I do have a question for Dave. Yeah.
I actually need to say one thing.
Yes.
One part of my speech that I skipped at the very beginning, which is I should have started like thanking for inviting me. A small thing, but I wanted to thank Elizabeth, Samantha, even Rebecca for your introduction. So thank you for having me. And also one clarification: we absolutely don't do lobbying, and even that has legal consequences. But in the sense that we don't attempt to shape specific legislation. It's very important. We feed them ideas. We try to motivate them. We try to explain how bad things are. Sometimes they ask us for help, but we don't go to the nitty-gritty of legislation, and that is not part of our mandate. So happy to answer questions.
Could we take 3 questions at a time? Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
So then, why don't we have? I think you have first hand. Okay. 1, 2, and 3.
Thank you so much for the talk, Dr. Missana. My question is regarding the feedback loops that you were talking about, especially because a lot of the leaders that are declining the climate crisis often fit their voting bases with misinformation. So I'm wondering how is the work that the climate parliament does with the leaders in those countries of addressing the issues of misinformation. How does that look like?
Yeah, thank you for being here and for your talk. My question was, it's more contemporary and regarding the rapid pace of AI development and heating up water and the use of natural resources. So I was just wondering if you have any data on how that's affected the global climate and kind of what the role of private organizations like those companies have on this global market.
Okay. The question is more general. I see that you are in the top of the conversation about the work. Are you optimistic about the conversation and especially about the reality of the result of these conversations? What do you think?
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you. Rebecca, your question was about the role of the climate parliament when it comes to misinformation and particularly the political feedback loop. A lot of the work that we do has been in the global South rather than the global North. Honestly, because of funding, a lot of our funding comes from development agencies, particularly in Europe. We were funded by USAID until very recently, with a contract that ended before the recent disruption. So I guess our role is to try to disseminate the right kind of scientifically based information. Our target is limited in the sense that it is parliamentarians. They're very influential, but they're a small group, and that makes our job a little bit easier. We were trying to change the conversation in a broader way, and then the parliamentarians can have a role of educating their own their own constituencies. Regarding AI, absolutely, AI has an enormous toll in terms of energy consumption. I actually happen to know somebody at Microsoft who is working on researching and thinking about this double thing, in the sense that AI can be a tool that can help us find certain solutions, and at the same time, it has quite a heavy environmental cost. One thing that we will probably be implementing, working on, is that one of the options of these green zones is actually data centers that are entirely powered by renewables in the global south. And that can, I mean, a lot of the work that we're going to do is about trying to keep the supply chain there, so it's not just exporting, in an extractivist way, resources. For instance, a lot of countries are doing green hydrogen, and one idea is to develop green industry with that green hydrogen, rather than just exporting the hydrogen, which in many ways, some people think it's like exporting water, because you make the hydrogen with water. If you export the hydrogen, you're exporting water at a time of very scarce resources. But AI is fundamental in the conversation for sure. Regarding the conversation and optimism, there are different levels of the conversation, and one of them is the official conversation. And I think it's very important that it happens with these negotiations at the highest level. As I was saying, in my opinion, they're very process-driven rather than connected really with the problem. So I'm a bit skeptical. Greta Thunberg, she says that is all greenwashing. That is useless, but it's just for the governments to appear to be. And regarding the cause, it is, there used to be no people from the fossil fuel industry at the COPs. It was completely, and little by little they began having lobbyists at the COPs, and recently they are the largest. I mean, the largest delegation by any country. And the last COPs have been organized in Egypt, the Emirates, Azerbaijan, and now Brazil. Next year, Australia. All of those are fossil fuel countries. So in a way, they are slightly co-opting the process. I mean, the Emirates and Azerbaijan are just oil countries. So them organizing the COP and having slogans that say, "The time to act is now." And regarding optimism, my colleague Nick Dangle that I had mentioned likes to quote Gramsci, who said, "Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will." Right. So things are not looking good, but you have to keep trying.
It's funny, you just anticipated that Gramscian. That was about to. Yeah, thank you for your talk, and I think you're right that balance between hope and pessimism is correct. But I wonder if you could comment more about our political climate here in the United States. I think we all know very well where Trump stands regarding climate, and the role the United States plays in the global system, economically, and so many other ways. How much of a setback is this? You see, I mean, I don't have to go through everything he's done already in this first 100 days. On the other hand, one country you haven't mentioned is China that much. Its huge role now, particularly in the development of renewable energy, and all sorts of other technologies, and now being one of the, I think, the biggest lender in development aid, including in Latin America. So I wonder if you could talk about that. And along with renewable energy, you also did mention the key technology is battery storage, which is key to scaling up renewables. Like if you don't have that battery storage to address intermittency, it's just not going to happen in addition to transmission. So that's really important, and California has been showing the way for that, among other places. So yeah, that's it.
All right. Since it's a long question, should I? Yes, of course, it's very concerning. We have contacts with the U.S. Congress, but we don't work in the U.S. Congress. We don't have funding to work in the U.S. Congress. absolutely, the elements that you mentioned are very important in the sense that the US will probably increase emissions. It is responsible for 11% of world emissions. So in a way, the US is opting out of the international conversation. The international conversation will continue. It's only 11%. So it's one very, very important country, the second largest emitter, but it doesn't stop the process completely. Our strategy is to go zonal, and we will even go zonal within the US. And we are in conversations even here in California to develop renewables and projects at a smaller level than even the state level. You're right that it's a big setback. For instance, we are working with the Green Climate Fund, and the Trump administration cut $4 billion of funding from the fund, which came from commitments of the Biden and even Second Obama administration. So the end of US aid, they were doing very important work on many areas. One of them was a big project called Power Africa, and specifically on a project called Mega Solar in Namibia and Botswana, that is connected with that line that I mentioned that we're working on. So the impact is enormous, but we have to keep working with the rest of the world. Regarding China, you're absolutely right. China is the biggest emitter. China is 30% of all global emissions, and it's very influential in Africa and in other areas through its investment. I would say in China, first of all, we do work in China. We used to have a group in the People's Congress, a large group, but not for Chinese standards. We collaborate with an organization called GATECO, Global Energy Investment and Development Cooperation Organization, that works on grids. It was more influential until the first Trump administration that really worked in isolating China, and the US implemented a similar project with the last G20 that was done in India, with India, to create a corridor that is sort of parallel to the One Road Chinese project, an economic corridor connecting India, the Middle East, and Europe. But I would say you have renewable energy China and you have coal China. China is the biggest producer of renewable energy and of electric vehicles by far, so they're pushing that revolution very fast. But coal China is very powerful. Some people say, trying to be optimistic, that the US withdrawing and particularly ceasing the incentives of the Inflation Reduction Act might stimulate renewable China, might give an option for them to take over. But obviously, coal China is very powerful, particularly because, unfortunately, China has coal resources. They have the material that they can then burn. They don't import it. But you're absolutely right. And regarding battery storage, absolutely. A lot of the technologies are mature. So HVDC has been around for decades. The UK is interconnected with, Norway is interconnected with the Netherlands, the UK, with Ireland, and others, through undersea cables. We are collaborating with an organization that is planning to generate solar and wind in Morocco and sell it in the UK through undersea cables at a very cheap price, about a third of the nuclear in the UK. But I would say batteries is the technology that probably is advancing faster. And also you have pumped storage, which is something that we promote a lot, where you pump through two bodies of water during the day when renewables are cheap, you pump the water up, and then during the time of more demand, you use the same differential to generate. And it's a way of storing solar energy through water. And also, going back to the Green Grids Initiative, people are beginning to think of grids as storage. If you have continental grids, those electrons that are circling around are not being wasted, particularly if you have connections east to west that allow you to prolong the solar day. So you can be sometimes exporting in one direction or buying in the other direction. Sorry, long answer to a
Long question.
On behalf of all the students in the room, what was your own personal pathway into climate activism? Did it happen at Stanford? Did it happen elsewhere? Or was it like a bolt of lightning all at once, or a long evolution?
I was always interested in the science, so I was reading about the science, and I graduated from a PhD at Stanford, and I went into to work in a foundation. And before that, I had worked in human rights, and after that foundation, I worked for a Chilean NGO doing works on education in Africa. So my trajectory was more the NGO / foundation nonprofit world, a little bit because of opportunities. It's, you look at things in hindsight and things have make sense, but usually, life takes you in one direction or another. And then there was an opportunity about 10 years ago to work in this organization. I knew the science. I learned about energy, to be honest. And I always really wanted to, but it was just an opportunity that came up.
And I piggyback on that amazing question and ask what skills that you attained maybe at Stanford or you refined at Stanford have allowed you to do this kind of important work over the years?
Well, I've heard, that PhD graduates have particularly sort of research skills and briefing skills. So I think that certainly was helping, kind of like the training of research and being able to process information efficiently. But it is also a diplomatic job. So I've learned that through hands-on. It's a lot about, as I was saying, building relationships of trust, because the parliamentarians are incredibly busy people, and they have no reason to work with you other than because they like what you do and they want to come to the meetings, et cetera, et cetera. So that is a skill that you develop through but certainly I would say the analytical skills for briefing up and for learning and researching that I learned here or developed here were very useful.
Anyone has something bubbling they want to share or ask? See, yeah.
I have a question, but it's not about me. Or
It's not about.
it's not about me. I just wanted to follow up on the question that Professor Wolf asked. And I was wondering, like, to what extent, I guess, the difference between the developed nations and developing nations affect your work, but specifically, for instance, you said that China is the biggest emitter carbon, but also we have that historically the U.S. is the biggest emitter by far, right? But then we also have maybe nations that recently discovered oil, like Guyana in South America, and then there are now taking action to, of course, exploit that resources because of economic reasons, and they want to develop. And I'm assuming that these countries also use this narrative, like, why wouldn't we do that if we historically haven't done that? And if that's just a pathway to developing specifically the local economies. And I was wondering how that affect your job, or how do you address that? Maybe, for instance, in conference that you said in Uganda or Rwanda, that maybe once you consider doing that, that maybe other countries.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, Uganda is another example of a nation that has relatively recently discovered oil. Unfortunately, in a beautiful national park. And they built an oleoduct to take it to Tanzania. So it's not good. But excellent question. Certainly, that north-south dynamic is very relevant. You're absolutely right that China is the biggest emitter. In a way, this might change with the new tariff situation, but one could think that China is the biggest emitter, but a lot of the emissions of China are from manufacturing goods that we consume. So in a way, we are externalizing our own emissions to the developing world. It's something to consider, right? You're absolutely right that the U.S. has historical responsibility is the biggest historical emission. That has played, I would say that what in the bureaucratic language of the UN was called a common but differentiated responsibilities was key, I would say, in the initial stages of the negotiations leading to the failure of Copenhagen. And the idea of Copenhagen, this was pushed by the Obama administration, was to negotiate cutting emissions. And that turned to the NDC. So I would say with the NDCs, that difference is not as predominant, but you do get that discourse. Some people say the global north climbed the ladder of development with fossil fuels, and now they want to kick the ladder away. But the case that we make is that it makes sense to leapfrog from fossil fuels to renewables for not only environmental reasons, but also economic reasons. And one of the dangers of developing fossil fuels is that you can have what are called stranded assets. Basically, oil it's not like just opening a big thing of money. You have to actually invest in order to then develop oil. And you might end up costing you a lot of money because nobody will buy oil once, these projects have a life. You have to recoup your money over a lifetime, and you will have stranded assets because you will not recoup those over the lifetime that you would have expected in the 20th century. This thing is, the situation is going to get so dire that that you're not going to be able to recoup your investment. But at the same time, renewable energy is a huge economic opportunity. It generates jobs, it generates exports, etc. So it makes sense. And it really doesn't make sense to bet on renewables. Sorry, to bet on fossil fuels. Everything that I've said.
That's a line that we can quote in December day.
Exactly.
Before we thank our guests, I just want to make an announcement that next week or the week after, May 30th. The week after, May 30th, we're going to have Professor Jaime Arauz from Universidad of Chile deliver a talk entitled Democracy in Latin America, Critical Reflections. So we look forward to that. And we want to thank you very much, Sergio, for the lucidity and for packing so much knowledge, so much precision in such a short period of time. Those of us who try to stay informed struggle to be at the level of really high quality information that you have provided. So I'm truly grateful and thank you very much. Thank you.